Do you ever catch yourself wondering how something is made or where it came from? Well, I'm here to inform you how something you probably use every day is made and where it originated. A cutting board is something that almost every family has sitting in a drawer on their counter that we never really think about how it's made or what kind of wood and decisions has to go into making it. The first topic I'll be informing you about in this speech is the origin of the cutting board. The second is the wood that is best used for the cutting board and why. And finally, I will guide you through the steps taken in building the cutting board. Wood has been one of the most available resources to make tools out of since the beginning of mankind. So there's a good chance in prehistoric times a caveman probably used an unfinished chunk of wood to prepare a day's kill on before cooking it over the fire. As mankind evolved and so did tools and machines, according to an article posted on November 11th, 2018 on DeckervilleLibrary.com, the invention of the table saw in the 18th century was a huge advancement in woodworking and the evolution of cutting boards and furniture. When the table saw was invented, it allowed for more precise cuts for the depth and width of wood you were cutting. This allowed for smaller pieces to be more finely finished and refined and made it easier to build a better cutting board. According to an article published February 24, 2012 on woodcuttingboards.com, since the advancement in technology allowed for smaller cutting boards, people would use them to eat off of. They called them wood trenches, and they started to become a suitable replacement for dinnerware back in the 18th century and through the 19th century. Even though the cutting board changed a lot with this invention of the table saw and other machines, the size still isn't the only thing that has changed with the cutting board. The wood used to build the cutting board changed a lot since the 18th century. We have a better access to hardwood now than they did back then. We also have the chance to choose a better wood and a safer wood for our cutting boards. Today there are all sorts of sizes, shapes, and colors of cutting boards. But what kind of wood is the best to build that cutting board? Well, when it comes down to what wood to use for a cutting board, you first have to look at the species of wood you're going to use and whether it is a hard or soft wood. Generally, hardwood is preferred to build your cutting boards. But some softwoods do still work, but most of the time you'll have to go with a hardwood. Since when we need hardwood, we have to pick the species of tree to use. When picking the species of tree, you have to look at several other characteristics also. Closed grain and open grain are two characteristics of wood that are very important in cutting boards. Generally, closed grain wood is the best to use for a cutting board, since it doesn't allow germs and other things to seep down in those pores, and you can just wash it right off. It is considered to be hardwood. The combination of hardwood and closed grain is considered to be the best combination for cutting boards. Now that we know what kind of wood we need, we have to pick the wood that fits in that criteria. Maple, ash, walnut, cherry, and beechwood are considered to be the most popular woods for building cutting boards and considered the best for it. After you determine the type of wood you're going to use for your cutting board, you can start the process of building your cutting board. Since you have your wood chosen, and you either have it in board form or scraps of wood big enough to make your cutting board, you have to make sure that there's a flat, even side on both sides of that wood. If there is not, and if it's a rough sawn piece of wood, you can use a planer to get those both rough sides down to smooth. Once your surface is smooth and planed down, you need to check both sides of your scrap wood and see if they're square. If both sides are not square, you need to make at least one side of the board square and run it through the joiner. After you have that one square side, you need to now cut it to proper length on a miter saw or radial arm saw. And with this, you take the one square side, put it against a fence, and cut another square side to your length. Once the material is the right length, you now need to run it through the table saw to get multiple pieces of wood 1 inch to 5 inches in width so you can glue them all together and create your cutting board. Once you have your pieces run through the table saw, you take your pieces, put them side by side with glue on a side, clamping them with a bar clamp to make sure that you have the right width and length of your cutting board. Once you have your wood glued up, you wait 2-3 hours before continuing the process. This is a cutting board I've glued up recently. As you can see, they're glued side to side with different variations of wood to create a different pattern, but overall, it's a width of 10 inches. Once you've been waiting 2 to 3 hours, you can now unclamp your cutting board. You may notice that the wood that you've glued up may have shifted or moved, and now the surface is uneven and not smooth. To fix this, you can run it through a planer and make sure that that surface is nice and smooth. Once you have a totally flat surface and the cutting board is the size you want it, you can now start the finishing process. The first step is to begin to sand your cutting board with an orbital sander at about 120 to 180 grits to begin with. Once you sand it with the first grit of sandpaper, you then raise the grain of the surface of the cutting board by taking water and running it over the top and rubbing it with your hand. You will notice that the surface starts to become rough, and then you let it dry. After you let it dry, you then go back to sanding. You start to sand it with a high grit of sandpaper, making the surface now smooth, and you proceed to sand it up into the grit you want. Once the cutting board is completely sanded, it is time to put a finish on the cutting board. With it being a cutting board and the fact that you're going to use food and other things on it, you have to make sure that the finish is a food-safe finish. My personal preference is to put several coats of mineral oil on the surface of the wood and let it absorb. Then, I take my personally made beeswax finish and rub it over the top. I put several coats of this on too, letting each coat fully soak into the wood before applying the next. Once the final coat of beeswax is finally finished and dried, it is now a smooth, matte finish on the surface of your cutting board. A lot like this one. This is a finished cutting board that I've done already, and it is fully finished and has been used several times. A cutting board is something you probably don't think about every day, but you never really think about what goes into the process of building it or where it originated from. There's a lot more that goes into building and choosing the right wood for a cutting board than you will realize. In this speech, I walk you through a little bit of the history of the cutting board, how to know what wood to use, and the steps in the process of making a cutting board. I hope the information in this speech gave you some insight of how a cutting board is made and shows you how much that actually goes into the little wood slab that you may have sitting in your drawer or countertop.